The Hornburg was the greatest fortress of Rohan, having never been conquered in battle. Though it's probably best known for the iconic Battle of Helm's Deep, it has a rich history and very interesting features that are often overlooked. Who built it? What happened to it during the Fourth Age? And how was it linked to Helm Hammerhand? Hello friends, it's Carl here, and in today's episode we'll be exploring the history of Helm's Deep. Now I think we should first discuss the location of this fortress, its layout, and its various defensive structures before we explore its history, as I feel it will give you a much better understanding of this fortress. So the Hornburg was located in a valley or recess on the northwestern borders of the White Mountains. Though this fortress is often called Helm's Deep, this is somewhat of a misnomer, for Helm's Deep actually referred to a narrow passage that led into the mountains that was located behind the fortress of the Hornburg. Now this fortress's first line of defense was a trench known as Helm's Dyke, which consisted of a wall made of earth with a ditch in front of it. It was around a mile long in length, and it ran from one side of the valley to the other, and at its center there was a passage which allowed a deeping stream and a road to pass through. Apart from its practical use, that of allowing easy passage to this fortress, this breach also served to funnel Rohan's enemies into a narrow point, rendering the advantage of superior enemy numbers useless. A small garrison would typically watch over this entrance, and during the War of the Ring, they were commanded by a man named Gamling. After passing through Helm's Dyke, one would come across a valley called the Deeping Combe that was around 400 meters in length, and it led to the Hornburg. This was a massive fortress with a tall tower, and there was a ramp that led up to its gate. Now this fortress was connected to the southern cliffs by a wall called the Deeping Wall that was 20 feet high and around 6 feet in width, and many holes were carved out into its stone, which allowed Rohan's archers to fire upon their enemies. There were two ways to reach this wall, either up a flight of stairs that could be found on its inner side, or through a stairway that led down from the Hornburg. Despite its strength, this wall had a single opening which was its weakness, a small drain through which the waters of the Deeping Stream flowed out towards Helm's Dyke. If Rohan's enemies somehow managed to breach the wall, they would reach Helm's Deep, which was a narrow pass that led to the Glittering Caves, and these caves had many secret passages that led all the way up to the mountains. Now these caverns were vast and beautiful, so beautiful in fact that according to Gimli, dwarfs would pay pure gold just to catch a glimpse of these caves, for its walls glittered under the torchlight, with many gems, crystals, and veins of precious ore, and its columns were twisted into dreamlike forms filled with wondrous colors. Now the Hornburg was first built by the Númenóreans, and together with Isengard, it served as Gondor's primary defense against an Easterling invasion. Over the years to come, Gondor's population in this region declined, and they gave this land to the forefathers of the Rohirrim, and it became known as Rohan, and so the Hornburg fell under Rohan's control. In the year 2758 of the Third Age, during the reign of Helm Hammerhand, the ninth king of Rohan, an army of Dunlendings appeared, led by a man called Wolf, and they allied with some enemies of Gondor, and together they defeated the Rohirrim and overran their lands. They slew Helm's son, called Hallet, and conquered Rohan's capital of Edoras, and Wolf proclaimed himself king. The Dunlendings even managed to defeat Helm Hammerhand and his forces, and they drove them back into the fortress of the Hornburg. Soon after, a terrible winter began, known as the Long Winter, and the garrison at Helm's Deep suffered greatly from the cold and hunger. In desperation, Helm's son, called Hamma, decided to lead a group of men outside to raid and gather supplies, even though Helm had advised him not to, and this expedition would end in tragedy, for Hamma and his men were lost in the cold and snow. Due to the famine and his son's death, Helm Hammerhand grew fierce and gaunt, and he would go out of the fortress alone, clad in white, stalking the camps of his enemies and slaying them with his bare hands. He would blow upon his great horn each time he set forth, and its sound echoed throughout the deep, filling his enemies with fear and causing them to flee. Yet one night, Helm Hammerhand did not return to the Hornburg, and in the morning the Rohirrim saw a white figure standing still upon the dike, frozen in place with his knees unbent. This was the body of Helm Hammerhand, and his valor and legacy would leave its mark upon this fortress, being henceforth known as Helm's Deep, and his horn was kept in the tower of the Hornburg. If you'd like to learn more about this great hero of Rohan, Helm Hammerhand, I'll be leaving a link to my video above, where I discuss his history in much greater detail. Now towards the end of the Third Age, the threat of war started to grow, and so the Lord of the Hornburg, Erkenbrand, began to repair its walls and strengthen this fortress. And in the year 2019, Theoden's son, Theodred, set up his base of operations in Helm's Deep to combat the rising threat of Saruman. Now at first, Theodred led the forces of the Westmark, though after he fell in battle, Erkenbrand assumed command of this force, and he started to gather men and supplies in the Hornburg, for he believed that Saruman would not attack Edoras until Helm's Deep had fallen. He also hoped to hold back Isengard's forces at the fords of Isen, and he sent out a messenger to Eomer asking for reinforcements, though Grima Wormtongue delayed this message. Erkenbrand then divided his forces, leaving 1,000 men in the Hornburg under command of Gamling the Old, while he set off with the rest of his force to the fords of Isen. Though they fought bravely, Saruman's forces would prove to be too strong to hold back, and they overwhelmed Rohan's defenses in the second battle of the fords of Isen, and Erkenbrand and his army were scattered in the process. Some of them fled back to Helm's Deep, strengthening its garrison, though Erkenbrand wasn't amongst them, and for a while his fate was unknown. During the War of the Ring, Helm's Deep would host a great battle between the forces of Rohan and the armies of Isengard. King Theoden would lead its defenses, and he was accompanied by Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and Eomer, while Gandalf had gone off on an errand, though he said that he would later return to Helm's Deep. Saruman's forces consisted of Uruk-hai, Dunlendings, Wargs, and half-orcs, and the great darkness crept out from Isengard, sheltering his forces from the light. His army was around 10,000 strong, for Isengard had been emptied, and they outnumbered the men of Rohan several times over. As they approached the fortress, the host of Isengard used their torches to set fire to the surrounding lands, trees, and fields. Now Theoden planned to keep the vast majority of his forces in the Hornburg, and only a few men were left to man and defend Helm's Dyke. The fortress was well stocked with provisions and horses, and 3/4 of the people of the Westfold had taken refuge in the glittering caves of the deep. Most of the men of Rohan were stationed behind and upon the deeping wall, as it was the weakest point of defense, and I think it's worth mentioning that unlike what is seen in the movies, there weren't any elven reinforcements in the books, and the battle was won solely through the valor of the men of Rohan. When Saruman's forces reached Helm's Dyke, battle cries tore through the silence, and the trench was filled with the bodies of slain orcs. The torches they carried made them easy targets for the archers of Rohan, though Saruman's forces would manage to overwhelm the first line of defense through sheer numbers, and the men of Rohan that survived fled towards Helm's Deep. The dark clouds above grew thicker as a storm started to form, and with each flash of lightning the battlefield was lit up, and the men of Rohan suddenly saw the overwhelming force that was approaching them. They fired volley after volley of arrows from the walls of the Hornburg, as Saruman's forces surged towards the deeping wall and the gates of the citadel, carrying battering rams to bring the Great Gate down. With each swing, the gate of the Hornburg was weakened, until many of its timbers were cracked, and its iron bars and hinges were bent. It almost seemed certain that the forces of Isengard would break through this gate, though Aragorn and Eomer managed to prevent this, for they led some men through a postern gate on the western wall of the ramp, and they managed to rout their enemies. While the gate was being reinforced with rocks and beams, a fierce battle was taking place upon the deeping wall, for the orcs had used grappling hooks to pull up ladders, and they were now fighting upon the battlements. Legolas was amongst the Rohirrim that were fighting upon the wall, and he had resorted to fighting with his knives, for he had run out of arrows. Some orcs had also begun to creep through the drain, gathering in the shadows of the wall, and they tried to rush into the deep and the glittering caves, though the men of Rohan managed to fight them off. To prevent another surprise attack, the drain was blocked with stones and rubble under Gimli's guidance, and the water of the deeping stream started to collect in a pool on the inner side of the wall. Though this threat was dealt with, a greater evil awaited them, for Saruman had created an explosive fire in Orthanc, and his armies targeted the drain, using this powder to explode part of the wall. The armies of Isengard then rushed into this breach, sweeping the men of Rohan away. Some of them, including Eomer, Gamling, and Gimli, were driven back into the deep and the glittering caves, while the others were forced to retreat into the citadel of the Hornburg. Now the glittering caves were a strong defensive position, for it had a narrow entrance, was well provisioned, and its air was wholesome. Yet Aragorn was afraid that the orcs might use their explosive powder to trap the men of Rohan inside these caverns, rather than fight their way through. Their situation had started to look dire, and Theoden decided that he would lead a charge out of the citadel of the Hornburg to either cut a path through his enemies or meet his end head-on, and he ordered his men to sound the horn of Helm Hammerhand as they rode forth. The orcs used the fire of Vortank once again to bring down the archway of the gate of the Hornburg, and it came crashing to the ground, though before they could charge inside, the horn of Helm Hammerhand rang out from above. Its sound filled the orcs with dread as it echoed throughout the deeps, and many of them cast themselves on the floor, covering their ears. This was accompanied by a rallying shout from King Theoden as he led a charge out of the great gates, tearing through the hosts of Isengard, and behind them Rohan's army emerged from the glittering caves as they too drove back their enemy. The army of Isengard was still filled with fear, for the echoes of the horn thundered around them, and Theoden's forces managed to carve out a path to Helm's Dyke. The morning light had finally pierced the clouds, and upon a ridge Gandalf appeared, with over 1,000 men on foot led by Erkenbrand, and the host of Isengard was caught between these two armies and defeated. Some of the Dunlendings laid down their arms and begged for mercy, and all the orcs were slain, either by the Rohirrim or by a forest of horns that had appeared close to Helm's Deep. For those of you who are unfamiliar with horns, they were sentient trees that were believed to be either Ents that had become tree-like or trees that had become Ent-like, and they were wild and hungered for vengeance against the orcs. During the battle in the glittering caves, Gimli sustained a head injury, though he was in high spirits, for he won a competition against Legolas that consisted of who could kill the most enemies, which Gimli won by a single kill, having slain 42 orcs. His head wound barely troubled him, for Gimli was still enthralled by the glittering caves, having been impressed with their beauty. In fact, he made an agreement with Legolas that if they both survived their quest, they would visit the glittering caves and Fangorn Forest together. Following their victory, the king and the wounded returned to the Hornburg to recover, while the rest of the men of Rohan took charge of the repairs and reorganization. The Dunlendings that surrendered were told to help with the tasks and repairs that were necessary, and they were promised freedom as long as they swore to never cross the fords of Isen or attack the lands of Rohan again. This act of mercy actually surprised the Dunlendings, for Saruman had told them that the men of Rohan were cruel and that they burned their prisoners alive. The fallen men of Rohan were gathered, and 2 mounds were raised in the fields outside of the Hornburg, and under one mound the men of the Westfold were buried, while the men of the Eastfold were buried in the other. A solitary grave was also made for Hama, the captain of the King's Guard, under the shadow of the Hornburg, for he was slain defending its gates. The bodies of the fallen orcs were gathered also, in a separate pile away from the mounds of men, close to the eaves of the Horn Forest. Yet their bodies would mysteriously disappear overnight, along with the Forest of Horns, and a huge pit had been delved in the earth, a mile away from Helm's Dyke. It's believed that the Horns had carved out this hole and piled up the orc bodies inside it, and they set many stones above them. This pit would be called the Dead Down, and no grass would ever grow upon it. After the Palantir of Vortank was recovered, Aragorn would use it in the Tower of the Hornburg to face Sauron, and following the ring's destruction, Legolas and Gimli would fulfill their promise to each other, and they visited Fangorn Forest and the glittering caves together. The beauty of the caves would leave Legolas speechless, and he said that only Gimli could find words that were fit enough to describe them. Some years later, Gimli would lead an expedition of dwarfs from Erebor to the glittering caves, and he became its lord. When Gimli first described the caves to Legolas, he said that no dwarf would be unmoved by the caves, and that they wouldn't mine its walls for stones or ores, but instead they would tend to them, working ever so slowly to bring out their beauty, and fill the caves with lamps, such as the ones that had once lit up Khazad Dûm. Perhaps this is what happened when the dwarf settled there. At least I'd like to believe that. Anyway friends, this wraps up today's video, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you're interested, check out our Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon links in the video description. And if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.